Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
And welcome in. Here we go. It is all aboard on Thursday, April the 30th, and it's just after 8:30 a.m., and so we always advise that things may have changed by the time you listen to this, and this week is a little different, so for a number of reasons. So let's get to the roundtable. I'm Dave Trafford. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Keith Leslie is here. He is the veteran political commentator, and you hear and see him on CHTV, as well as a regular here on the Ledge. The Honourable Kathleen Wynne, the 25th Premier of Ontario, with us this morning. And then playing the role of Tim Hudak as our resident former leader of the Ontario PC Party, John Tory is here. Spent a little bit of time in the mayor's office in Toronto, so he's got a thing or two to say about a thing or two. And Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley here with us as well. Welcome in, everybody. I just want to start by saying, Brian, it seems, given the pattern of conversations we've had on the podcast over the last, I would say, month or more or so, we will not start this conversation with, at a unrelated news conference, Doug Ford said this week. The premier's been very quiet this week.
Yeah, as he should be. He's had a rough couple of weeks. And when you have those sorts of weeks, as both Kathleen and John can tell you, sometimes the best thing to do is just go away. Don't go away, man. Just go away and be quiet. Make the public miss you again. Between the jet thing and then, his horrible, ridiculous insult to Stephanie Smythe. There's a lot of things wrong with the insult to Stephanie Smythe. But the fact that she's a former journalist meant that the gallery, of course, would only gang up on him because journalists defend journalists, even former journalists. So bad news all around. I've been thinking for some time now that the government seems aimless. And so when the polling started to show up, even before the liaison poll came out, I was writing that they seem kind of aimless. They seem to lack direction and need to go somewhere. He needs to find a vision again if he wants to stick around.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that in detail, but let's just pick up on that, Kathleen. The premier did, according to Stephanie, reach out over the last weekend and apologized for it. The problem with this is we're still talking about it a week later.
Well, and he apologized because his advisors, I'm just imagining, said, you got to do something because it was not okay what you said in the House, and you've got to apologize. But his instinct was to say what he said. So that's why we're still talking about it. And the apology was fine. Okay. But this is who this guy is. And I think it's, as I think I said last week, it's reverting to form. It's not a new person. It's not a new image. And we'll come back to the agenda of the government. But I've said many times that those first couple of years in the legislature, I was there. There was no vision. There was no plan. And the government was all over the place. COVID changed that. And now we're reverting to form. I think that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, John Tory, when I talked to our communications team on Now and Next this week, it was Bob Reed, Lindsay Broadhead, and Anne-Marie Aikens, and we talked about this, and not necessarily from a political perspective, but the communication clang that happened as a result of his, unnecessary ad hominem remarks about Stephanie Smythe. And again, you compound that with the fact that he was avoiding the question, which is top of mind for a lot of people in Ontario, and that is FOI and accountability. So he kind of slid further off the cracker, if you will, than he would have in the first place.
Yeah, but look, when you mentioned it, you're right on to something I think that's very important in all of this. I mean, I think everybody that's made the points so far have made very valid points, and he's just out there answering on too many things too often. And so when Brian said he's taking a break, it's a break he should take. I was saying to you before we started recording that I worked with both Brian Mulroney and Premier Bill Davis, and the problem they got into is when they started answering for every question, every issue. And every day there was a comment on every issue. And of course, the public started to think, well, I guess you're in charge of that issue because I hear you talking about it. And then you're inclined to say things you shouldn't. But the real other problem he said is just communication. The jet was so mishandled, where you just put out a statement saying we bought a jet. I think it even referred in the statement for the Premier's use, as opposed to the 19 other things you could have said you were buying it for. And, so on. They didn't even try to sort of put up, I'll call it a defense of buying a jet. And the apology thing was allowed to kind of fester for a day or so. And he did the right thing, which was the right thing. And look, we all have slipped up and said things in the heat of the moment. I'm not so sure it is the real Doug Ford. I tried to know who the real Doug Ford is, but he's actually can be quite a gracious person. But having said that, that certainly was an example of grace. So it's just been a bad couple of weeks, like you say, and he should stay underground for another couple of weeks and then come back and focus on the issue. Is the real issue, affordability and all of that, the economy, and that will serve him much better.
Well, Keith, if our friend John Wright were at the table this morning, he would be pointing out that yes, you need to be quiet and not be answering on every file. But he also points out the runway that the Premier's got. So there's still recovery time here for the Premier and the government to get back on track. And we'll get into the polls in a second. But the one of the comments that Lindsay Broadhead made on the podcast Now and Next earlier this week, she said, Doug needs to be looking at this as a CEO, and right now he's sort of a lower-level VP who's got his hands in everything.
Yeah, he doesn't need to be at the podium answering every question. And to John's point, the minute you start answering those questions, we in the media will, okay, you own this issue. We're going to keep coming at you for it. The thing with Stephanie Smyth, that insult to Stephanie, and he has called her, I guess, and apologized, so she says. I think he needs to say it in the House next week. I think he needs to repeat that apology because the insult was hurled in the House. It's in Hansard. And I think he needs to complete it by standing in the legislature and apologizing when the House resumes next week. He shouldn't have said it. He knows he shouldn't have said it, whether it took his advisors or not to convince him of that. I'm sure he realized it was, absolutely the wrong thing to say, not just because of the way it played out. It was just in his heart, he must know that was dumb. He shouldn't have said that. And especially compounding on top of the whole jet fiasco. And she was asking a very on point and not over the top question about the Freedom of Information changes, which we've already seen that it's been proclaimed into law. And already we're seeing the Trillium reporting that their Greenbelt request that they were on the verge of getting answered has been blocked because the legislation has been changed. It's already having an impact going all the way back to the Greenbelt. And of course, as we know, that FOI legislation goes back retroactively to 1988. What is being hidden? All of this was just extremely bad messaging by the Premier, self-inflicted wounds. And as I said, I think he really should wrap it up, put the bow on this by standing in the House next week and telling Stephanie that he is sorry for what he said in the legislature and on the record.
Are they hiding your secrets by going back to 1988, Kathleen? What a weird date to pick.
Because we're all FOI'd, Brian. The proof is in the pudding, So I don't think there's anything to hide on the Liberal side. That's for sure.
I do recall to the issue of the Premier answering all the questions. I once tried to get David Dalton McGuinty on something, and he quoted Bill Davis by saying, "The Premier of the province does not have to have an opinion on every topic." And I asked him if there's any other Bill Davis quotes he'd like to make, but he didn't. But it's true. The Premier, the minute you wander into those areas, we're just going to keep coming. And so maybe best to walk away for a couple of weeks, especially given the previous 2 weeks that he's had.
So the advantage of that, John, is that the Premier is kind of out of the limelight and he's not taking those slings and arrows this week in terms of standing at the podium and making whatever comments that get twisted or torqued or however it is. And last time Brian was on, he said, they were at a news conference and all the media walked away never quite knowing what is our story today because there were so many elements to look at. But what happens, though, is now the opposition has the floor. I mean, they've got this week, and I think they've made pretty good use of it, where in the past they haven't. And the Billy Bishop Airport, Little Norway, the expropriation of the island has been front and center, and they seem to be actually gaining some momentum around that file in terms of how the Ford government is handling or mishandling it.
Oh, that is the problem, though, with answering every question and with commenting on every issue, is that you give, no matter what you say, you're going to keep that issue going. And the opposition has the luxury, although I never found being in opposition to be a luxury at any moment in time, but you have the luxury of picking which one you're going to sort of focus on, especially in a week when the House isn't sitting, but even in the week when it is. And, so he opens himself up to being a target on 20 things, as opposed to saying, no, I'm either going to say nothing, breathe through your nose. What was the old expression? You never get in trouble for things you never said, and that's largely true. And when they come back, they'll have 5 more things. So I just think he should regroup. Let's remember as well, he had a major staff change, and I'm not sure that I'm not blaming that on anybody that came or went, but that's a big deal, as Kathleen will know, to have your head staff person leave and transition to somebody else, even if they're familiar to you. So it may be some things, fell between the cracks when all this was going on, and that's why you saw what you saw. But he's just got to regroup, and he's got to get back to rationing himself out on the issues that are good for him, which are the economy, bit of the Captain Canada stuff, affordability. Those are the issues he should be talking about, and no other.
Does the airport, though, Kathleen, become more of a wedge, not just for him at Queen's Park, but him municipally? Because, again, we were talking about this earlier in the week. It's almost as if the Premier's not running in the municipal elections, but he is going to be front and center in terms of the election strategies.
Yeah, so I think for the people who are in the city in the municipal election, the people who are worried about what's going on at the waterfront, and particularly about the airport now, I think they will be looking for someone who's going to run against Ford. So he set himself up as the opponent, I think, to the people who are concerned about the livability of the waterfront. So yeah, I think he's inserted himself, but he loves that. He loves being part of the discussion municipally, right? I think that being the Premier of Ontario he likes that job, but to the degree that it allows him to be the mayor of Toronto, he really loves that. So
What?
I think he has he's set this up.
Well, Brian,
And you know what? This is not my turn,
Yeah.
Dave, but look, I think that the person who'll be taking him on, he will love that too, because it will advantage her. And I think quietly, he doesn't think it's such a bad thing of Olivia Chow, notwithstanding all the things he said previously, if she gets reelected. And this has given her a perfect thing to sort of run against him. And she won't do it in a personal way. She'll just do it and say, I'm fighting for the park and I'm fighting for this and for that, and solidifies her base. And he gets to be sort of involved as a player. And I think it will help her.
Yeah, Brian, I think that as soon as this announcement came out that we're having the expropriation, not just of the parts of the island. I mean, the whole map looks like it's the whole island is up for grabs. That Little Norway Park. We're talking about the runway extension. If the story in the Globe and Mail this week was that they could be adding another 900 meters of runway into the lake. So all of this, all I could think of was that Chow's team is looking at, yay me! This is going to be great for my reelection. And actually distracts from a lot of the things that she should be paying attention to in the city of Toronto.
Like the decline of the city. I've never seen politicians who like to play off against each other. I've never seen that. This is, as John said, good for both of them, and they will both lean into it and have a good laugh about it later. Does it help someone like Brad Bradford? No. But at this point, he appears to be the only serious candidate that's thrown his name forward. A couple of other people, including John, deciding not to run this time. So does it help Olivia Chow? Absolutely. I don't think it hurts Doug Ford, though, because it's very different than 2015 in terms of support for expanding the island airport and bringing in jets. There's a very different mood in the city, even in that part of the city, than there was when Adam Vaughan won Spadina Fort York by running against the airport. So I don't think it hurts either one of them.
Keith, the idea, though, and again, I think we get to a tipping point once we start to see another kilometer of runway into the lake, landfill, all of that stuff that's going to happen. That, to Brian's point, I think people have generally come to accept and enjoy the convenience, shall we say, of the airport on the island. But once we get to this point where there's so much drama around it, where it is going to affect the use of the lakeshore, where we're even talking about is it going to affect housing builds in the East End. All of these things then become, what the hell are you doing? And again, John would say, when you're explaining, you're losing.
Not to mention the traffic in that area already.
Mhm.
The minute you get south of Lakeshore, it's just jumble. I mean, where do you go? And if they're going to take out that little park there, which, by the way, I like sitting in little Norway Park before I get on a flight, because it's the last chance to get some fresh air before you're locked up for the next while. I think the whole issue is going to raise more opposition as people become more engaged again. It will be a big factor in the municipal election. As you say, it gives a lot of local candidates, including the Mayor Chow, to something to run against. And Premier Ford's something, a lot of people love running against, and he will love the battle of it all. But for the most part, I think that this whole future of where we're going with this is still up in the air. It has yet to be decided. So who's going to win? Who's going to lose? I think there will be a lot of public opposition again, as there was in 2015, to putting basically another kilometer of runway into the lake and adding that many more people coming through that little airport. I know they're going to rebuild the airport. Well, does that mean it's going to have to be closed for a year or two while all this goes on? That's not a good thing.
I was down at Queen's Quay yesterday, Keith, talking about sitting outside, watching the planes land, enjoying the waterfront, and realizing that I was sitting about a kilometer from the former waterfront in Toronto. That whole area is reclaimed land. And you go back to Front Street is where it used to be, and then about 100 years ago, it was where Harbor 60 is. Harbor 60 was the waterfront.
On the harbor.
Yeah, that was the very edge. You walked out the door and there was the water. So we've done this before. We've reclaimed about a kilometer of the lake in that area, and it's even a lot of all of what Ontario Place is reclaimed land, which is why I laughed every time there was opposition to redoing Ontario Place and people were calling it pristine parkland. No, it's dirty infill. It's the land there is not clean. It's not good.
Well, it's
But
good.
Brian, I think Keith's point about congestion in that part of the city, I just I have not seen anything that suggests that they're going to be able to exponentially increase the number of people who are trying to get to the airport, and that can be done in a way that is going to be good for the city. I just don't buy it, and I don't understand what the imperative is. I don't know. Maybe there is a business case for economic development by having this increase. Again, I haven't seen anything very compelling on that, but I think the frequency of the planes and the congestion are going to be a huge problem for the city, not just for the people who live down there, but for the city in general.
Even if it doesn't increase the number of flights, it is better for the city. The jets are quieter, and they use less energy. They have lower carbon footprint than the Dash 8s that are there now. So in all ways, cleaner. You're going to have less noise and less pollution from...
But it is going to increase the number of flights, Brian. It's going to increase the number of flights. It has to.
Why would you invest? But look, you're both right. I mean, Brian is right. The jets are inevitable and they're quieter and more environmentally, but take it from a guy who lost an election for mayor in 2003 on this very issue. The more that you raise these practical issues, which again, if we go back to Premier Ford's difficulties, as much as he'll enjoy this fight, they threw this on the table without having answers to these questions. And I can assure you, even in Etobicoke, I can well remember being out in Etobicoke and Scarborough and thinking, why would anybody out there care about the island airport? But when you raise issues like crowding at the foot of Bathurst Street or the number of flights in the air. Remember the most powerful cartoon that David Miller used against me to help to defeat me in the end was a cartoon that showed like 28 747s waiting to land at the Toronto Island. Of course, there was never going to be a 747. There was never going to be 27 in the sky waiting to land. But it was a powerful thing. And Robert Kennedy, now the crazy Secretary of Health in the U.S., he came up to campaign on it. So you might remember that. And it was all about those issues, not about jets. I mean, jets are a red herring, but congestion on the mainland, number of flights, incursion into the lake, those are going to be issues. And they'll have a great fight about it. And I think it will benefit Olivia Chow, and Doug Fordand will probably not be impacted by it one way or the other. He doesn't have a lot of support anyway, relatively speaking.
Well, if we're talking about specifically Toronto in this case, I mean, we can expand that. And we've talked before, Keith, about what's going on in Niagara. And I know that while the House wasn't sitting this week, the committees were, and, there was a committee conversation around the Ford decision to extend the strong mayor powers to appointed regional chairs. And again, getting a lot of pushback and flack over that. Reorganizing Niagara probably needed to happen. But again, he's on the ballot in Niagara.
Well, absolutely. And taking the regional council there down from 32 to 12, which is going to be just the mayors in the Niagara communities, that probably makes a lot of sense. I think there'd be some support for that. But then appointing the chair and giving that chair strong mayor powers, basically powers over all the other mayors. A minority can rule now, basically, on the Niagara Regional Council and on other councils where they're going to give these strong mayor powers. That seems on its face undemocratic. And again, it's a pause, if you will, or a walk back from their original idea of amalgamating all those Niagara communities into 4 or even into 1. So they're going forward with this, I guess, is the next logical step. But it does, just on its face, it seems just blatantly undemocratic to give these appointed CEOs, appointed chairs of the region, more powers over the elected mayors from those regions. I don't see how it can sell it, but they're going to do it, and they're going to sell it on the same line that the Premier's been using the whole time: fewer politicians. There are more politicians in Niagara locally than we have at Queen's Park representing the whole province. It's an easy sale, but I don't think locally it's going to be quite so easy.
Well, John, I know that the strong mayor powers were, they landed on your desk when you were at City Hall, and you were kind of cautious about how you would approach that. Can you imagine the first day that one of these regional chairs decides that she is going to use one of these powers to to decide that, go against what council otherwise would have wanted? That's just the hue and cry will be crazy.
I think so. It kind of depends on what issue it is. But having said that, here's the difference. I was cautious about it, and I was elected. I had a mandate from the public, and I was going to be accountable to the public had I run again. But these are appointed people, as you pointed out, who are going to exercise these powers. And if it's on a trivial kind of issue, I don't know why you do it. If it was on a trivial issue, then people won't have a hue and cry about it. But if it's on a significant issue, you're right. And I think the main sticking point won't so much be the strong powers thing. I think people sometimes actually like that somebody's going to make a decision about something. But having said that, I think the fact that that person, the chair, will not be elected and is going to override all kinds of elected people will be a big deal, as it should be.
Yeah, and again, it's just Kathleen. It's not just happening Toronto, Niagara. We've seen this kind of crop up in other regions in Ontario. It was an interesting take I got from the comms people this week as well, where there's so much focus on Toronto. There are municipalities like Windsor and London and other larger, mid-sized communities in the province that might not care what's going on in Toronto, but they feel like they're being ignored at the expense of Toronto.
Yeah, I think that that goes back to what I said about the Premier's sort of fixation with Toronto, and I think that that's probably true in terms of other parts of the province. Wondering what on earth, we've got lots of issues here that need to be tended to. The sort of patchwork of process around the province on these regional chairs. I mean, John will know this. You think back and you think, I wish I had. I wish I had moved on having all the regional chairs elected, because there was there was a moment at which we could have done that, and I was trying to do what we did, which was consult with people and try to come to some kind of consensus, which there wasn't. But now we've gone in, I think the Premier's going in exactly the wrong direction. I think that if you wanted a standardization, standardize to an elected chair everywhere, that would have been better. But I also think that there are lots of problems with the two-tiered governments and regionalism anyway. It's not standard across the province. It's not kind of systematic, and I think there needs to be a better review of that, because it is still a bit of a hodgepodge. But this is the wrong direction, and I think locally people are going to be very unhappy with it. At least in the initial stages, and then it will be what people live with, and they will forget that there was a moment when there could have been a more direct locally democratic process. So yeah, people's memories aren't that long, I'm afraid.
Well, Brian, the question around, how the province is approaching the municipalities, the regional chairs, et cetera, sort of leads into your piece this week, the headline being Doug Ford's poll numbers slump as government seems aimless. So, and I know you cited a couple of examples, but boy, the more you look at it, there's a 360 issue here in terms of where. How would you define this government in terms of its approach, its target, its objectives, and what we're going to get? Are we going to be better off at the end of this mandate?
Kind of shotgun at the moment. Just to comment quickly on the regional government side, never been a fan of it. Lived in a few places that had it. I lived in Ottawa when, Jim Watson was my mayor and Bob Shirelli was the regional chair, and it kind of felt like you had two mayors. At the same time, it was confusing. So, the amalgamation in Ottawa didn't work out all that well, but it at least cleared things up. So do you amalgamate? Do you just get rid of them, go back to very local government? I don't know. I don't think the regional chairs are the right answer. But to John's point, strong mayor powers, there's an argument to be made if you're elected. There's no argument to be made if you're appointed. That is an affront to democracy. It's, Doug, what will people feel better off? Look, I think he's done some good things since being elected, and most of them in a very nonpartisan way, getting the Ontario line moving, supporting major public transit projects in Mississauga, in Hamilton, just recently uploaded the LRT in Ottawa. There's a lot of hospital expansions going on. The Vaughan Cordalucci, I know that started under your government, Kathleen, but finishing that. These are all good things, and he's got some good legacy projects. But what's the point of him being there now? What drives him? What is the agenda, the vision for the government? I couldn't tell you what it is. And voters are the ultimate, what have you done for me lately, people. As I was thinking about it, I was reminded of that part of The Life of Brian by Monty Python. Doug Ford could sit down and say, well, I've done this, this, and this. In that section of the movie, they say, well, what have the Romans ever done for this? Well, sanitation and public safety and all that. Yeah, but other than all of that, what have you done? And that's kind of where voters are always at. And he's said very publicly several times that he intends to run in the next election. Well, why? Give us a reason. Give us a reason for why you're still governing. This is not I'm not saying, hey, you've done a horrible job, you need to get out of here. But, I think the poll numbers are slumping. Sure, the Jets part of it. But just kind of an aimlessness to the government. And, sure, they'd love to run him against Nathaniel Erskine Smith, who I think is a surefire way to get a fourth Doug Ford mandate is to make him leader of the Ontario Liberal Party. But you can't just rely on your opposition being weak. And if he faces off against someone like Navdeep Bains, who is a very good organizer, that's a very different thing. So there's a lot of uncertainty for Doug Ford going forward.
Yeah, Keith, I wonder, based on what we said about the Premier being quiet, how much of this is part of the conversation this week in terms of, okay, here's where we are. We need to do a reset, because it's not just Liaison had the poll out. I mean, Abacus has had the poll. We've seen slides in his personal approval. Tim Hudak in the past couple of weeks has talked about, political gravity kind of catching up to him. It's been a long time that they've been in government. So, and I realize, he loves the job and all of these things to be very difficult for him to step up and do what Brian said and kind of just, okay, that's enough for me. But at some point, there has to be a come to Jesus moment.
Well, I don't think there's any more liberalization can be done to the liquor laws. I think we can drink anywhere we're going to be able to drink at this point. So what is the big vision? What's the accountability? To Brian's point, I mean, they are investing a lot of money in schools, hospital rebuilds, infrastructure, roads, highways, this kind of thing. But what's that doing for the little guy, the average guy, as you say? What's the help when I need it right now? What's the vision? Why do you want to be there as Premier? What else have you accomplished? Besides, as I say, we can drink just about everywhere now, including in the parks, on the beach, at concerts, at festivals. What else have you got? What are you going to give us that's going to make us say, we need to keep the Conservatives in power because Doug Ford is going to deliver this? Now, he's got 3 more years to find this vision, to find something that's going to, keep people engaged and not just, the big jets and all this stuff at Toronto Island. He's got to get something that's going to connect with people, that's going to make people say, we need a 4th Doug Ford government, a 4th term. That's a big ask, especially when right now we talked about those polling numbers that are out this week. The one I always keep an eye on, and Kathleen and John will both know this number, it's time for a change. And that time for change in one of those polls was at 72%. Now, 3 years out from the election, lots of time for him to change that, but that's a wicked high number, and that's one that's very slow and hard to reverse.
It is.
John. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Well, I was just sorry, Kathleen. It is hard to reverse, but let's remember again, there is no election happening now. He does love the job. And let's remember one other thing, which is that the numbers you see now are heavily influenced by what's going on in federal politics. I mean, I know from years of helping all of these people I talked about from the distant past, Premier Davis and Prime Minister Mulroney, there's a quite a solid interaction or interconnection between federal polling numbers and provincial. The Liberals are at an all-time high, including in Ontario right now, the federal Liberals, and that washes over into people answering these questions about politics. And the other thing is, I say this, just as an observation, even if, let's say, Navdeep Bains, as the best of the potential candidates for Ontario leadership, was there today, I think Doug Ford would still end up winning an election, just like he did last year. What did he win on last year? He won on saying, well, I'm here and I'm the steady pair of hands to deal with Donald Trump and these other people aren't. And I think he would still win, notwithstanding everything we've said today. So I just think it's one of those things where there's a message in all this, especially the 72% chance for a change and all that. The message is, all the stuff we've talked about this morning, particular real issues and all that. But he is not in a position where, he's not so much massively unpopular as people are like, where they just they dislike him like they did Mr. Trudeau at the end. He's just, sort of in a situation where he's at midterm, and that happened. And he's now got to regroup, as we've said this morning, from that and start fresh. Maybe next week would be a good place to start.
But regrouping can't mean stay the course, John, right? I mean, he just can't be hanging in there. We're just going to keep doing the same thing we've been doing.
Well, yeah, but no, you're right. Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, if he's got back on to regrouping by sort of showing up on the issues that people are really concerned about at the moment, affordability, the economy, job losses, unemployment, youth unemployment, and so on, and did not get into all of these other things that he gets into at every press conference, 10 or 15 other issues, it will perhaps stabilize. And then you rebuild back. If somebody made the point, when it comes to you're in a hole, you got to rebuild back. And he's got 3 years if he wants to run again. He's got 3 years. That's a long time in this business, as we all know.
And by that point, Mark Carney might not be the most popular guy in the country.
Right.
I mean, the Carney effect is at play here, just like previously when Justin Trudeau was early on, it helped the Ontario Liberals. When Justin Trudeau was at the end, it really hurt the Ontario Liberals. These things go back and forth, and so look, my maxim is voters are fickle, polls can change, campaigns matter, and we've all been at places where somebody was definitely going to win or somebody was definitely going to lose, and then they didn't. And I think we point to 2014 in Ontario is a good example of that when. If I remember rightly, Kathleen, you were way back in the polls, and Tim Hudak was destined to be the next premier. And I think the election call was made at 9:05 when polls closed at 9.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of time. When I look at the polls this morning, it warms my little liberal heart. But I know they're not going to stay there. I mean, it's a moment in time, and I think the Mark Carney effect is huge right now. Without a leader, it's impossible to tell exactly what people think. So I think all of that is true. But I think there's another factor, guys, and that is, and I sat in the legislature. He ran against me in 2018. So I was standing there in the debates. I was in all of those conversations, and I can tell you there was no vision. The Ford machine was running against us. They were running against. They were not putting forward a plan, and many of the things, Brian, you talked about the Cortellucci, the hospital, but there were all sorts of other things that. Yes, they repealed some of the things we were doing, but a lot of them they've gone back to, or they continued projects that we already had put in place. The fact of the investments in infrastructure, that was a continuation of what Dalton and I were doing. So all I would say is that unless there is a major regroup and the government comes up with a plan that really meets the moment, as you have said, in terms of affordability and so on, or there is another resurgence of Trump, taking on Canada, whether it's the CUSMA negotiations or whatever, because that's why he won the last election as handily as he did, that early call. I mean, I was knocking on doors. It was all about having somebody to stand up to Trump. And the fact is that this premier has been at his best when he is reading that teleprompter on an issue that is of concern to everybody. COVID, and then the threat from the United States. But when he is untethered by one of those big issues, it's very hard to know what he stands for. It's very hard to know what his vision of the province is. That's what we saw in the first 2 years, and that's what we're seeing now. So if that continues, we're going into teacher negotiations, This is not going to be an easy year coming up for the premier. And yes, he's got 3 years, but it starts to get very short when you get into the end of the second year. So I think that there's a lot of work that has to be done in terms of telling the people of this province what it is he stands for and how he is meeting their needs, because that's not happening now. And there are all sorts of distractions that are the kinds of things he wants to talk about. And if nobody reins him in, if there isn't, and I think there has been a change of staff that has had a huge effect, John. I don't know the people, I don't know the players at all, but there's a distinct difference in the way Doug Ford is disciplining himself as opposed to, a year ago.
One
Kathleen?
asterisk I'll put on this, Dave, if I
Yeah.
can. You and I were talking before we went on about the fact that they have actually achieved something quite remarkable, depending where you come from on this stuff, which is in 8 years in government, they have not raised a tax or a charge. And in fact, they've taken some away. Now, does anybody know they've taken these things away? Do people remember they're not paying for their driver's permit renewal? Do people know that the gas tax has been down for some time? And that is something he can talk about. And yet he's managed to spend quite a lot of money. I mean, he's a bigger spender than people acknowledge. Bigger. I think they talk about you being a big spender, Kathleen, but he's bigger. But having said all that, I mean, maybe if he got back even to talking about some of that relates to that core issue of affordability, I mean, it's going to be better than talking about the Island Airport or the jet. He has done that. So when people say he has no purpose, I think that is a purpose that massively motivates him to be able to say, go back all the way to when he was, Rob's brother, and they were there together saying, "Stop the gravy train." He would say, "I've not put my hand in your pocket in 8 years," and I think he would get some credit for that. He doesn't get any now.
Well, but John, the backdrop now is going to be $6 billion taken out of education, and teachers, that's $750 that teachers are supposed to get. They're not getting all that money. Some of that's being scooped up by the boards. Like the size of classes, the lack of supports for kids with special needs. That's going to be the backdrop against which he says, "I've never raised a tax." And I think there are lots of people who say, "Well, okay, but what has that meant for my kid? What has that meant for my mother who needs care in hospital?" I think that there are a lot of things that are going to come home to roost now that are not going to make that cut in revenue seem like such a brilliant idea.
Yeah, although I will say, having fought a number of elections where taxes was a big issue, you can't underestimate the fact you only need 38% of the people who say, "I like the guy who's not putting his hand in my pocket," and it's still a big issue with a lot of people. Not even in times of affordability crisis, it's always a big issue with people. But you're right. I mean, that's going to be the contest. Do you like this guy that doesn't put his hand in your pocket? Or are you fed up with that because it's cost your kids or your healthcare system or your this or that? And so that will be the battle lines. But he has something he can talk about it if he wants to on affordability and say, I've probably been the best when it comes to all the governments at not putting my hand in your pocket when you didn't need it there.
But he's
Well,
utterly
Keith,
failed on
Keith, just let me ask you this though, Keith. Based on that, the issue for me then becomes down to the way I posed it to Brian. Am I better off? Period. I mean, for all of the things that they say they may have done in terms of not charging me for this or eliminating that fee or this tax, at the end of it all, as an autism family, am I better off? As a family that supports someone who's in long-term care, am I better off? There are benchmarks there that are going to be very difficult for them to get over.
As someone who's had to go to an emergency room, am I better off? As someone who's got kids in school, are my kids better off? All these things, these are the day-to-day, the nut and bolt issues that haunt a government because they're not really achieving what they need to achieve on it. Can they make some differences here? They can. There's absolutely lots of room. Do they have the ideas, the brain power to get this done? I'm not clear. One of their signature issues when they campaigned again, not last election, the middle election, was housing. And they have utterly failed on their housing policy. Ontario is in the worst shape of any of the provinces in constructing housing. Some of it is market conditions, but other provinces are managing to get these things built. Ontario is not. It's so far off its goal that it no longer even mentions the goal. There's an area, again, if they can rework their housing policy and get it where it is making a difference, where the housing prices, not just condos that no one wants to live in, have come down, but everything comes down to a reasonable rate, or affordable, if that word can actually be used in the housing. They've got some idea, they've got some room here to do something, but so far, that's a huge failure by them, and they don't like to talk about it, but they have to. They're going to have to get some sort of housing policy back, or it's just going to get worse. The whole affordability crisis stems really at the top of the housing. That's the main goal most people want to get to, is be able to afford a house. Well, if you can't afford groceries and rent, you're not going to be able to afford a house. So the government's got to do something about the affordability issue. But they've already done, as John said, they've removed the provincial gas tax on the gasoline. There's so many things they've taken. You're not paying your $200 vehicle renewal sticker. These sorts of things, but people, that's gone. To Brian's point, what have you done for me lately? And that calculation, the government has to remind them what they've done. But it's basically it's a tough sell, especially when you're going to be going for a fourth term.
On housing, they just came up with the agreement with the municipalities to cut back on development charges.
Yeah.
But that could end up being more of a win for, say, Olivia Chow or Andrea Horvath than it is for Doug Ford. They might be the ones that benefit from that policy. I'm not sure that people are going to relate that to the government. Of course, we have to see if it actually works, if it will get more houses built. They have thrown so many things at the wall on this since 2018, and it hasn't helped. There's a lot of other factors at it, but it has gone steadily downward instead of upward.
The headline this week, John Tory, Doug Ford ordered government employees back to the office, then worked from home himself. Global News reporting the Premier, who ordered the government employees back to the office 5 days a week in January, is a remote worker himself. They got access to FOI details, and they point out the records reveal that for the 5 weeks beginning in January, Ford worked from home, often taking meetings at his home or attending them virtually. I will point out that those first 5 weeks of January, the legislature was not sitting. So, and again, that's not necessarily the sole reason why he would have to be in his office at Queen's Park. Are we making much ado about nothing here?
Yes, I really did think so. I worked for Premier Davis all those years ago, and he worked from home. He lived in Brampton, which was a bit further out and so on, but he worked from home a lot. And I think anybody who has that job, I was a big in the office person because I thought that's where I could see the public servants. I could see my own staff. I was just comfortable there, being there and making decisions when I was mayor. But I think the notion that people in that kind of a job, and look, half the time what he's doing is working at home from 9 to 11 and then going out to an event that might be in Guelph or in, Sudbury or something. So I just think it is much ado about nothing. I think we should get on with discussing the real issues and not this. I understand the juxtaposition of saying I'm telling you to go to the office and I'm not. But at the end of the day, we're talking about apples and oranges here, and I don't think it is a real issue. I don't think that election will be decided on it. And he is who he is. He does like to work from home. He does like to take meetings at home. And he's in the office too a lot, but he's also all over the province. So it's a non-issue, as it would have been for Kathleen Wynne, as it would have been for me. I mean, people do this job the way they do it. It's all about results.
Well, Kathleen, was also pointed out, I think, in the story that a number of people were joining the meetings remotely as well. So there's no telling exactly how many of the people on those team meetings were actually in their office at Queen's Park. And again, I think the whole idea of forcing people back to the office 5 days a week, just making it a mandatory issue, I think is a little heavy-handed or unnecessary. But again, speaks to the do what I say, not what I do sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we, and by we, I mean humanity, I wish we could learn from the past. I mean, I wish we could learn from experiences. I think that during COVID, we learned that there are really interesting possibilities in terms of hybrid work, and that there are lots of people who can't do that, but there are some who can. And if we can save those people time in terms of commuting, and if it takes cars off the road, and we can still get all that work done, then why can't we allow that? Balancing that with the need that I really believe, which is to have human contact, to have people in the office by the water cooler, which probably doesn't exist anymore, the bottle refilling tap. I just don't understand why we have to be so categorical about these things. And I think that's what's gotten Doug Ford into trouble on this, is that he was being dictatorial in terms of everybody has to be in 5 days a week, even if it didn't make sense in certain jobs. And then, of course, the hypocrisy of him working at home. Look, I wish I'd had a big enough home to be able to have dignitaries and meetings. I didn't do that. We lived in a semi in North Toronto. But did I work at home? Yeah, I worked at home early in the morning and late at night, but I really liked being in the office. I didn't mind being at Queen's Park and bumping into people in the halls and having those meetings be more public. That didn't bother me. But he's got a different modus operandi, whatever. I think it is a problem if it means that it leads to secrecy. And I think that's the other piece of this is, are there readouts from those meetings that there would be if they were at Queen's Park? Is there an accountability issue here? I think that is a question, but he is who he is. It's just that to be dictatorial and not to learn from what we experienced during COVID, it just seems really short-sighted to me. It just seems like a bad idea. And it's not going to work because there are corporations that are allowing for hybrid work. And I think ultimately all our workplaces are going to have to be more hybrid if that's possible in terms of the kind of work.
I think you're right about that, but I do want to take on the word dictatorial, Dave, because at the end of the day, there are a lot of corporations where the CEO said the same thing. And what it is as simple as the pendulum of life going back and forth. And things had gone so far in terms of people not coming to work, they had to do something quite rigid to get people back to the office. And I think all of the corporations and governments alike will back off and sort of say the reasonable position, as Kathleen said, is a combination of things, a bit of flexibility and latitude, because it's just the way it is. But I don't think he's any more dictatorial than the presidents of a lot of big companies who've said this, but they had to do it to kind of put a marker, in the ground to say you've got to come to the office sometime, because there were a lot of people who weren't coming at all. So I just think that's a bit of a harsh word, but I think he'll relent on this position, as will the TEOs.
Brian, the news out of the education file this week, kind of interesting on a number of levels. First, the idea of banning cell phones from schools. And as I read into the story, I was shocked to hear that there's a regulation around cell phone use by kindergarten kids in schools. I mean, what 5-year-old is bringing a cell phone to school? But overarching, I'm thinking this is probably, speaking of this pendulum swinging too far the other way, probably not a bad thing to be addressing. My grandkids are all under 10. None of them has a cell phone, and I can't imagine that their parents would be in a position of considering even giving them access to a cell phone before they're 15 or 16.
I remember talking to teachers when my kids were in high school, and they were my kids did not have cell phones. We're not taking them to school. But, hearing from teachers that any attempt to control cell phone use was often met by resistance from not only the students, but at times the parents. I've heard teachers tell me how they tell a kid not to answer the phone in the middle of class, and the next thing, the parent is showing up at their door saying, "How dare you not, or tell my kid not to answer me? I need to reach them whenever I want." I can't imagine being a teacher in this setup. How the government deals with it, I don't know. I mean, it can be useful. I guess we'll, what is it that we used to hear? You won't always have a calculator in your pocket, is what they told us when I was in school. Well, we all have a calculator in our pocket. There can be a usefulness to it, but it does have to be regulated. You can't have the kids just texting each other or being on social media. So between that and apparently a lot of kids believe that they should study from home and a hybrid schooling, I guess, they're not showing up. There's all kinds of problems in the education system that have nothing to do with the government or who's in power. It's just, cultural and social things.
Yeah, go ahead, Keith.
I just wanted to pick up, if I could, on this whole thing about the premier working from home. I hate these stories about the politicians, premiers especially, not, the suggestion being they're not working, they're slacking up. Politicians work the longest days, the hardest, 7 days a week. I mean, they're just, especially premiers and prime ministers, they're always on. And I think the media just looks small when we do these things. I remember during the pandemic, and you guys remember the story, Premier Ford was photographed with some snowmobilers. And he was being criticized for snowmobiling during the pandemic. You don't think that those 4 snowmobilers talked to him about the pandemic and the closures and everything else? They're always on. I just really think that these kinds of stories make the media look small. There's a lot more to criticize and to report on than this type of thing, and I just really hate it.
The talking to the OPP details, some of the guys that have been there for a long time, to give you a sense of how long the hours they work are. I've heard from some of them that they did miss the Dalton McGuinty days because Premier Ford is out all the time, which means they're out all the time. The premier in between Premier Ford and Dalton McGuinty was out all the time. I hear he had a very busy schedule, Kathleen. And so sometimes they've made a joke. Dalton McGuinty was a lot easier than these last two because he went home at night and stayed in. I challenge anyone who thinks that elected officials are lazy. If you're lazy, you don't stay in the job. You are voted out. With rare exception, in my experience, that's the case.
So the remote work thing, I think, should happen. I think there needs to be some policies, and he's going to have to back down on that a little bit, I think, at some point. But the premiers are all working. They all work hard. They work long hours. And as I say, I hate to see the media do those stories. Sorry, Kathleen.
Well, I was just going to say everybody works differently. Dalton worked hard. He worked differently. He was a more, I'm going to say, than me. He was a more reflective person often. And he's written 2 books since he's been premier. So clearly,
I've got the other one over there. Yeah.
Yeah. So we all work differently. I think it comes down to, are we available and accountable? History will judge us on that, all of us.
The cell phones, Dave, I just saw a story yesterday in the New York Times. A study showed 20% of children under the age of 5 have a cell phone. Now, I don't think
that's freaking criminal. I don't
outrageous.
Get that at all.
It's just stunning. And so the guidelines, whatever needs to be set as much for the parents, and it'll give all parents a common ground to say, look, this is the rules. No social media, no cell phones, smartphones till you're 16 or whatever we decide upon. But it's going to help everybody. And the parents need to be educated on this, to Brian's point, as much as the students and the younger people do.
I think with all of the conversation going on around social media, and I appreciate the fact that Wab Canoe is out in front of this in Manitoba, and the Premier here in Ontario, and the Ford government talking about similar things. There needs to be, to your point, Keith, I think a national standard in terms of how we're approaching that. All right, let's leave it there. That is your edition of On the Ledge, the Ontario Politics Podcast. Thanks for John Tory and Brian Lilley for stepping in this week. Of course, thanks as always to Kathleen Wynne and Keith Leslie. John Wright and Tim Hudak promise to be back next week. I'm Dave Trafford. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics Podcast. Enjoy your weekend.
Pay no attention to that man.